Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Harris, the president of Temple Ami Shalom. Thank you. I don't think I deserve the applause for all that cars and traffic that's out there, but unfortunately there was a little bit of a mix-up, and but the thing is, they did invite us to come down for a little munch after if we want to have something. So there you go. Anyway, welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. It's our pleasure to extend our hospitality to you. And thank you to the Zeller family for sponsoring, as they always do. And thank you to a lot of our old friends that we haven't seen in quite a while. And truly a pleasure. We're going to today have a discussion on the book, The Butterfly and the Axe by Dr. Omer Bartov, and right over there. And kind of got a little bit of idea of who he is and what he is, and I think you're going to be enthralled with everything that you hear. So on that, I'm going to told I only have a minute, so I'm done. I'm getting this. So thank you for all being here again. And Rebecca, I don't know who's coming up next, but Shelley. Okay, thank you all again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Derek. And good afternoon, everyone. Again, sorry about the mix-up and the late start. There was a little bit of double booking, but we're all here now, ready for a wonderful program. Welcome to our 25th annual book festival of the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. Before we begin, please turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate if you haven't already done so. I see some people reaching for them now. I'm Shelley Klein, co-chair of the event with Barbara Levinson, and we have a lot of people to thank. Thank you to the Zeller family for sponsoring this event and providing the beautiful reception that will follow our program. Lynn Zeller was a beloved member of this community, as well as a member of the Book Festival Committee for many years. Thank you to Temple Ami Shalom for hosting, to Sue Morris for managing the event, yes, and the members of the Temple Sisterhood for doing the work, yes. Thank you to our dedicated committee members, our advanced readers, the Federation staff, our hardworking coordinator, Rebecca Russell, the Jewish Book Council in New York, from which we choose our books and authors, our tech wizards, Jake in New York and Mike in West Covina, and our literary circle members whose financial support make events like this possible. As our Jewish Book Festival celebrates 25 years, our Jewish Federation is also celebrating a milestone. The Federation is 30 years old. And 30 years of bringing our community together with programs like the Book Festival, PJ Library, various cultural arts programs, and more, while serving as the Jewish voice for our community. And boy, do we need that now. To mark this achievement, we've planned some 30th anniversary programs throughout the year, so watch for them, including our 30th anniversary celebration brunch on Sunday, June 23rd, where we'll be honoring our past presidents, saluting our first 30 years, looking forward to our next 30 and more. This evening's program will be a presentation by Professor Omer Bartov, followed by a question and answer period. Please save your questions till after the presentation. For those on Zoom, just go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can type in the questions at any time. The chat will be disabled, so the questions have to go into the Q&A. If you wish to purchase this, it's up here, this or any of the other books, you'll have an opportunity after the talk, and the author will be available to sign your purchase. Those on Zoom can purchase the book at any of our in-person events. And now it's my privilege to introduce Omer Bartov. Professor Bartov received his BA from the University of Tel Aviv, his PhD from the University of Oxford. He was a fellow at Harvard, Princeton, and Rutgers, a Guggenheim Fellow, and the Raoul Wallenberg Professor of Human Rights at Rutgers. He is now the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, where he's taught since the year 2000. He's published many articles and commentaries, several nonfiction books specializing in analysis of the role of the German military, as well as the history of Galicia during the Holocaust. And he received the 2018 National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category. Tonight's book, The Butterfly and the Axe, is a departure for Professor Bartov. It's a work of fiction based on fact, which challenges the very nature of fact and fiction, of story and history, of remembrance and memory. Welcome, Professor Bartov. We are honored that you're joining us. We look forward to your presentation.
And somebody left their glasses here in case you need them.
I didn't need them. I printed it out there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really humbled to see you all here, and thank you whoever is on Zoom. What I will try to do today in the next 30 minutes or so is say a few words about this book, what the conceit of this book is, and then read a few extracts from it. And after that, I'll be happy to answer or respond to any comments, questions you may have. This book is the result of various factors, the most important of which is that in 1995, I interviewed my mother, who was then just a year and a half older than I am now. I was then 41, and I asked her for the first time ever about her childhood. And she spoke for an hour and a half. I turned on a tape recorder. This is how we recorded then. And she spoke. She was making chicken soup and talking. And all I have about her childhood is that 90-minute conversation, because 3 years later, she passed away. She turned out that she had cancer and she passed away. And it was because of that conversation that I thought I should know a little bit more about the world that she came from. She came from a town called Buchach, which is now in West Ukraine. It used to be in Poland. Before that, it was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Jews called it a shtetl, but it was not for everybody who lived there a shtetl. About half of the population were Jews and the other half were Poles and Ukrainians. And as a result of that conversation, I spent 20 years researching that town, learning East European history, Jewish history, Polish history, Ukrainian history, because until then I'd been a German historian. And I wrote a book called Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, which came out in 2018. And as I was completing the book, which is based on a great deal of documentation, but also on many personal accounts, testimonies, diaries, conversations, memoirs, I realized that after 20 years of researching that town, I knew probably more than anybody else in the world about what happened there, certainly during the Holocaust, but I knew nothing about what happened to my own family. My mother and her two brothers and her parents left Buchach in 1935 and emigrated to Palestine. The rest of the family stayed there. And all I knew about the rest of that family was a little bit from people that she mentioned during those 90 minutes of conversation. And she did not remember much about them because she was 11 when she left. And they were never seen again. And that made me think that I'd say more intimately about the limits of my own discipline, the limits of history. That, bless you, that as a historian, you have to use documents. You can't just invent history. You have to use what you have. but what you find in archives. But when you realize that you're writing about an event in which thousands upon thousands of people disappeared and never appeared on the historical record, you're basically writing a history with them left out. And I thought about that also through the prism of my own family. And there were several stories there that especially struck me, very short stories that my mother mentioned in passing during that conversation, one of which was about her father's sister. And her father's sister was wanted to be married to someone who had an education. And she found somebody who actually had a university education. And because she married this man, she was known in the family as the jewel in the crown, because she herself didn't get much of an education, but her husband did. But he could not find a job in Galicia in the 1930s because he could not get a university position. This was under Polish rule. Anti-Semitism was becoming stronger, certainly from the mid-1930s. He could not even find a job as a teacher in a high school. And so eventually, my great-grandfather had a mill and told him, why don't you run the mill? So this man with a university education was the manager of a mill. He didn't know much about it. Most of the work was done by his wife. That couple had a child. And during the war, they apparently, and that was the rumor, they left the town, which was Buchach, a larger town. It had about 15,000 people, and they went to the ancestral village from which the family had come. It was a small village on the banks of the Dniester. But when they came there, and it's not entirely clear, they had a child, they might have had a baby. They probably also had a baby. When they came there, as my mother put it, the goy who agreed to shelter them, meaning a Ukrainian farmer there, said he would help them, but they had to get rid of the baby. Because babies cry, and if you're in hiding, you will be discovered. And they didn't. And so they died. And we don't know how. And this story sort of stayed with me. And so I thought about this question, and I realized that it was not only the people who disappeared, who just cannot be written into history because you have no documents about them. And history in that sense is so unfair to those thousands of people who have no life. We know nothing about their lives and nothing about how they died. But also that the knowledge of that, the knowledge, the very scant knowledge that we have of their disappearance, of the violence that occurred there, has somehow traveled from one generation to another. That event that we know occurred, but we know very little about, has affected one generation after another, and has in many cases warped people's lives because of that. And it's not that it passed in the DNA, it's because the people who survived it brought that pain and that trauma with them, and somehow that affected their children and affected their children's children. And so I was interested in that question too, and how then can we return, so to speak, to the site of the crime in order to somehow remedy this, to bring some tikkun to that particular case of murder. So this is what I tried to do in this book. This book really, it is a work of fiction, but it's written in a way that, in a sense, it's the way I would have written it had I had all these documents. Only I had to invent the documents because they don't exist. And there are documents, there are testimonies, there are letters, there are confessions, there are various kinds of documents, and only one of them is a real document that I integrated into the book. I don't say which one it is, but one of them is a real document, and all the others are invented. And so having said that, I will read you a few passages. I have to warn you that one of them is a little explicit, but I'm sure that I won't be the first one talking to you about some aspects of the Holocaust. So the first section is from a letter by the narrator's mother. So the narrator is someone who has some similarities with myself, but not exactly. So a letter by the narrator's mother describing a visit by her uncle's wife, whose name was Tova, to their hometown in Galicia in 1939, where she met her husband's sister, Rochale, known as the Jewel in the Crown, because, as I said, she married Max, who had an academic education. What became of Max and Rochale in the last years before the war, I know from Tova. I distinctly recall her telling me that she and Rochale had so much in common, though Tova was 24 and Rochale almost 30. Both of them had little girls. Hanale was 4, and Rochale's Judith was just a year older. And both were married to men who did not quite accomplish what they had set out to do, and were made unhappy not only by their own failures, but also by their wives' disappointment in them. So here were these two women asking themselves where had they gone wrong, and if they could repair the damage, one by leaving and the other by returning. The highlight of Tova's visit was the trip they all made together to the family's old village of Miezhin on the banks of the Dniester. Or was it the Dnieper? It was the Dniester. Tova said they were so happy and carefree there, just like little children with all of their lives still ahead of them, running through the forest, watching the logs flow down the river, playing with the girls on the beach. They would sit by the fireplace late into the night and dream about their futures as if nothing stood between them and their desires but the darkness of the night that would soon lift with a glorious sunrise over the vast expanse of trees and water. They wandered through the old house where the new estate manager, a young, energetic man keen to modernize the estate, hosted them. He found the old Grafina, that's the Duchess, the owner of the estate, he found the old Grafina to be too set in her ways, especially since the passing of her sister, but got on well with the two sons. Unfortunately, they were mostly away in Lviv and Warsaw and had little interest in farming. This Dmitro and his wife Oksana had been great hosts and served them delicious dairy kasha. Our region was famous for its groats from which kasha is made. Oksana was expecting and already was a little heavy. She was a young woman with delicate features and a beautiful, thick, blonde braid. Tova and the rest of the family were not very interested in Dmitro's agricultural plans, least of all Max, who had reluctantly agreed to come down with them, but kept seeking opportunities to withdraw somewhere and stick his nose into his book. But they listened because they did not want to offend Dmitro, possibly the first Ukrainian to ever manage the old Polish estate. He was so proud to have bought off the Schumers, that's the family name, whose name had been linked to this estate for as long as anyone in the village could remember. Dmitro was actually a Hutul, one of those people who lived mostly in the mountains. And he told them that up there in the Carpathians, there were very different Jews, muscle Jews, he called them, who worked as loggers and carpenters and blacksmiths and were just like their neighbors, only they prayed to the Jewish God. Where he came from, he said, everyone was as poor as the next person, but all were free and independent. Things there in the mountains are not as they are here, he said, where people in the village speak badly of the Jews behind their backs and are only waiting for an opportunity to beat them. The villagers, he said, told him that they were glad that the Shumas had finally left them in peace and that one of their own was in charge. All they needed now was finally to be rid of the old Grafina and her arrogant sons, and all would be well. Tova told me that above the fireplace, close to the table where they had celebrated many Shabbat dinners and Passover seders, Dmitro had hung one of the only items he had brought with him from the mountains, a large axe with a broad, hand-forged blade. It had a beautifully carved, long wooden handle, and had been in his family for generations. It was a symbol of the tough and proud Hutzul mountain-dwelling nation, where every man must own a bartka, as he called it, a tool that serves every purpose. It could be a walking stick and a hammer, or could be used to cutting down trees or fending off wild beasts and robbers. He took the bartka off the wall and let the guests touch it. In the afternoon, one of the stable boys, Michailo, a nice but taciturn lad, wearing clothes so tattered that they seemed to be made from discarded rags, and walking barefoot, took them across the meadow toward the Grafina's house. There they met her two sons, Vladek and Yannick, who were there with their families over the summer. They were tall, elegantly dressed, middle-aged men, very different from Tova and Rochale's husbands, the doting old revolutionary and the downcast scholar. They reminisced about the days when they were boys on the estate, playing soccer on the village green with the two Schumer boys. Leaning on their walking sticks and smoking long pipes, Vladek and Yannick asked about Yaakov and Adolf. Asked how Yaakov and Adolf were doing in Palestine. They did well to leave, they said. This place is going to the dogs. Behind them, the mansion was visibly falling apart, with its plaster peeling and some of the window panes missing. The garden was covered with weeds, and the general impression was that of a charming Italian ruin you see in travel books, not a dwelling for aristocrats. There were butterflies everywhere, of all colors and shapes, flying up and down in unison, like a vast multicolored blanket, as the little girls chased them across the meadow. They had quickly become firm friends and were utterly happy together. Hanale was heartbroken when they eventually had to board the train for the long journey back, passing through endless fields heavy with grain and vast forests stretching as far as the eye could see. From the train window, they waved to little village girls leading cows to pasture. The geese were running alongside the railroad tracks, and Hanale cried and cried as if they would never see them again. They never did. So that's the first extract. In the second extract, Tali, and I'll just say a word, Tali is an Israeli girl, she's an Israeli woman, young woman in her 30s at the beginning of this story. And she traces her family back to the Shumas, to the family that comes from this region. And she's traveling in Ukraine with a young British man of Ukrainian origin that she met in Ukraine, who's called Andriy. And as it turns out, his family comes from the same place, and they discover that. So in this section, Tali tells the narrator about a visit to the family's village in 2003, the village of Miezhin, together with Andriy and what they discovered there. Less than a mile from the bridge, we turned right onto a dirt road and spent the next hour bumping along it, driving in and out of patches of forest and farmland, with fleeting glimpses of the Dniester to our right. Finally, a rusty metal sign indicated that we had arrived. Throughout the drive, we had hardly exchanged a word. Andriy drove slowly into the village, a single street of small houses on either side with fields stretching out behind them. Andriy rolled down the window and spoke with an old man walking down the street. The man became quite animated. Then he got into the back seat and began giving Andriy directions. Our path took us toward a patch of forest, separating the village from the river. In front of us were the ruins of a mansion surrounded by tall trees. The roof had caved in, and the vegetation had taken over the interior. Our friend, Mikola, tells me that this is where the Polish estate owner and her sons lived when he was a boy, said Andriy. My grandfather worked here as a stable boy. His grandfather is Mikhailo. He stopped the car and we got out. There was a wonderful smell in the air of pine, soil, and food being prepared. Across the dirt road from the mansion were a few low houses. This must have been the estate manager's house, Andriy said when we reached that spot. The houses were all abandoned. Why is no one living here? I asked. The old man had stayed by the car, and I could now hear him shouting, calling out to us. I turned back and saw him pointing at one of the houses and gesturing, passing a finger across his throat, and I could not quite tell whether he was grinning or expressing horror. What is he saying? I asked Andriy. He says that there was a murder here, and people are afraid to come to this spot. They say it brings bad luck. Who was murdered? When did it happen? Mikola lit a cigarette, coughed, and spat on the ground. Ask him, I insisted. We should go back to the village, Andriy said. I don't think he likes it here. Let me just walk around for a bit. This is where my family came from, I said. Andriy looked surprised. I thought they came from Porushenia. My grandfather, Adolf, was born and grew up right here on the estate, as apparently did yours. It had become warmer, and one could almost sense that spring was around the corner. We walked over to the large house in the yard, which seemed to have withstood the ravages of time better than the mansion. I tried the door. It was unlocked, and we walked slowly into the dark interior of an almost empty room. They were afraid of ghosts, said Andriy, but they took all the furniture. There was a large fireplace at one side. Above it hung a large axe with a beautifully decorated handle. That's weird, Andriy said. You would have thought that the peasants wouldn't leave this behind. There was a gust of wind and the door slammed shut. All I could see was the blade of the axe shining on the wall. I held Andriy's arm. Let's go, I insisted. We made our way back to the car, where Mikola was patiently waiting, smoking a cigarette. Hey, look, I called out. A beautiful large butterfly was hovering over the bushes by the car. A harbinger of spring, Andriy answered. We drove back to the village, where Mikola insisted that we join him for a glass of vodka. We sat in the tiny enclosed porch of his house, which seemed to have only one large room. He was a wiry man, with a deeply creased face and bright blue eyes. He smelled of sweat, alcohol, and tobacco. His wife, a large woman, brought out a tray with vodka and glasses, a loaf of bread, and a jar of honey. The sun streamed through a filter of finely woven curtains, casting geometrical shapes on the table. Outside, chickens pecked in the yard. We raised our glasses. I told them that your family once lived here, said André. They're very happy that you have come to visit us. I thanked them and asked if they remembered my family. No, André said, they were little children during the war. People in the village say that the Polish owners always had a Jew to manage their estate. But just before the war, the Jews left, and the estate was managed by someone from the Carpathians, a Hutzul. Do they know what happened here? Mikola poured another round, but André refused. I told him that I have a long drive ahead, he said. Mikola lit a cigarette and talked for a while. I did not want to interrupt him and waited until he finished. As we left the house, we saw that neighbors had gathered on the street, eager to watch the unlikely visitors. We got into the car and drove off, taking with us Mikola's lingering order. What did he tell you? As we bumped along the dirt road, I felt lightheaded from the 2 shots of vodka. Mikola told me that when the Germans came, the estate manager was a Hutzul, whose name may have been Dmitro. The Polish owner, the Grafina, had died, and her sons were deported by the Soviets. So Dmitro managed the estate, convinced that the sons would eventually come back to reclaim their property. But people in the village thought that this was just an excuse to take over the Poles' property. Dmitro had twins, 2 babies born just when the war began. The Soviets didn't mind him taking care of the farm, but for a while, some of their men stayed in the mansion and messed it up. A bit later, when the Soviets fled from the Germans, they took with them most of the furniture and any valuables they could lay their hands on. No self-respecting German would have wanted to stay in this ransacked hole in the wall, so they left Dmitro and the village in peace. The villagers were jealous of this Hutzul because he had so much land and livestock and could do whatever he wanted now that his masters were gone. He never moved into the big house. A few months before the Soviets returned, a rumor started going around the village that Dmitro was hiding Jews on the estate. By then, there had already been many killings of Jews in the area, but Meren, which is the Ukrainian name of Mezhin, hadn't had any Jews since your great-grandfather sold his house to Dmitro. People heard about Jews being killed in nearby towns, but that had not affected their own lives, apart from the fact that since the Germans arrived, there were no Jews to buy their produce. Instead, they had to bring it to the market themselves, and market days in towns such as Porushenia were very different after the Germans came. In any case, it was after most of the nearby Jews had been killed that those rumors began circulating about Dmitro hiding Jews. People said, this cunning Hutzul, not only has he taken over the Polish estate, now he's making a fortune from the Jews he's hiding. He gets rich while we are getting poor. Other people worried that Dmitro's actions would put the whole village in jeopardy and that all the houses would be burned down if the Germans or the Ukrainian police found out. But no one denounced him. In the end, Dmitro himself was at the root of what happened. In spring 1944, André continued, when the Germans began the retreat from the area, the Wehrmacht took up positions in many remote villages. And one company, Mikola was sure it was a Waffen-SS unit, established itself in the village. The company commander and his staff set themselves up in the old mansion. This was very dangerous. By now, everyone knew that Dmitro was hiding a Jewish family under the Germans' noses. Because just weeks before the SS arrived in the village, the Jewish family had been blessed with a baby, and the farm laborers who lived nearby could hear the cries of the woman who delivered it. They soon established that this family was made up of a young couple, a little girl, and a baby, who was delivered in Dmitro's house with the help of his wife. No one knows exactly what happened, but when the SS company relocated, the Hutzul and his family disappeared, and no trace was found of the Jewish family Dmitro had allegedly hidden in the barn. And since the Germans had burned down the barn as part of the scorched earth policy they implemented everywhere as they retreated, it was impossible to confirm whether there had, in fact, been any Jews there in the first place. Some people thought it was just a malicious rumor, as no one had ever actually seen them. But then, why did the Hutzul take his family and flee, leaving behind all their property? Was he afraid of Jewish revenge now that the communists were returning? So the last extract I'm going to read, there's a last extract and then just a little bit. This extract is for Mikhailo's confession to his grandson, Andriy. So Mikhailo, who is the farm boy who lived there in the late 1930s, turns out to have been Andriy's grandfather. Andriy was very attached to him throughout his life and believed that that Mikhailo had been a liberation fighter during the war and grew up greatly admiring his grandfather. When his grandfather dies, he leaves behind a confession, which Andriy reads in 2016, so just a few years ago. Now, I'll read part of it. I won't read the whole thing, of course. No, that's fine. That's what babies do. The more I watched, the clearer it became that the Germans were packing up. The sky was becoming just a little lighter, and I could distinguish the tops of the trees against it. Another military vehicle had been positioned behind the big truck, its light serving to illuminate the space between them. I could see soldiers loading the truck with various objects brought from inside the villa. I remembered that I was supposed to meet Stepan and his men before dawn, but could no longer move, since the soldiers might notice me, and if they did, they would shoot me on the spot. Gradually, the darkness lifted, and I could see that the Germans were ready to go. The commander came out of the villa and got into the car. He drove toward the village, where the rest of the unit was billeted, followed by the big truck. For a moment, the sound of their engines filled the air. Then it grew still again. I looked around the yard. It was a beautiful spring morning, and birdsong filled the air. It was still very cold, though. A large butterfly was hovering close to the ground, and then, perhaps carried by a light breeze, glided almost to the top of the barn. At that moment, I distinctly heard the cry of a baby, rapidly smothered. It almost certainly came from inside the barn. They're in the hayloft, I thought. Go up there and take care of them. I heard Stepan's baritone behind me. I turned around, and there they were, the whole group, armed to the teeth. I jumped to my feet. Can you handle this pistol? Stepan handed me a German Luger. We'll make sure the Hutzul doesn't get in the way. Do you want me to kill them? I asked, trying to sound as calm as I could. Of course. Why do you think we're here? Do you want to be a fighter or a stable boy? I've never fired a weapon in my life, I answered, handing back the pistol. Then I heard the door of the estate manager's house open, and saw Dmitro stepping out. He was holding his axe. "What are you doing on my property?" he called out. "You'd better leave right now. And let go of that boy, too," he added when he saw me behind Stepan's back. "You're hiding Jews here," Stepan said calmly. "How dare you accuse me of that?" Dmitro responded. "Do you think I'd hide Jews when the Germans are everywhere?" "Well," said Stepan, "now the Germans are gone, so you should have no worries about letting them go." "I'll do as I please on my property," Dmitro answered, and started walking forward, the wide blade of his axe glittering in the early morning sun. "I know who you are," he said to Stepan as he came closer. "You are that no-good bastard who squealed about your own people to the Bolsheviks, and now you're playing at being a hero again." 2 shots rang out, and Dmitro fell lifelessly to the ground, still holding his axe. "You should really learn to use the Sluga," Stepan said, observing the pistol. "The Germans make damn good weapons, but since you can't use firearms, you'd better take the axe. I'm sure you know how to use that." I walked over to Dmitro's slumped body. His head was a bloody mess. You could not see his face in the distance, I could hear someone shrieking. It must be Oksana, I thought. I felt nothing, as if my insides had frozen. The other guys were joking around, making fun of that stupid peasant and his axe. He was holding on to it so tightly that I had difficulty extracting it from his hand. Finally, I stood up, holding the axe in both hands. It was a beautiful tool with a large, broad blade and an intricately carved wooden handle, now spattered with Dmitro's blood. Oksana was screaming my name in the distance. "Go over there and shut that woman up," Stepan said to one of his men. "Now get on with it. We don't have all day," he said, turning to me. He was still holding the Luger, tilting it this way and that, as if to see whether it was well balanced. I walked over to the barn door and pulled out the wooden bar. A couple of shots rang from out behind me, and Oksana's screams now turned into something I had never heard before, like cries from a wild beast whose limbs were being torn apart. "You can go and play too, boys," Stepan said to the other men. "I'll keep watch over the stable boy." I walked into the dark barn. It was cooler inside and smelt of manure and fresh hay. I let my eyes get used to the darkness and saw a ladder at the far end, its top part leaning onto the hayloft. I slowly approached it. Just before I reached it, someone leaped at me from behind a bundle of hay. I swung at him with the axe and heard the dull sound as the blade hit his head. He died without a whimper. It was a middle-aged man, quite thin. He had no shoes on and smelt of urine, excrement, and sweat. I had literally split his head in half. In the light increasingly streaming into the barn from the narrow opening at the top, I could see a pair of round glasses on the floor a few feet from him. I stuck the handle of the axe into my belt and climbed slowly up the ladder. All I could see were piles of hay scattered all over. I reached up to the low ceiling and opened one of the hatches to let in more light. Now I could distinguish the figure of a woman in the far corner. She was hunched over a little bundle and appeared to be silently weeping. Her long hair was filled with bits of straw. Just as I raised the axe, she cried out, "Loif, Loif!" I could hear the little steps behind me, and as I turned around, I saw a little girl scurrying down the ladder. The woman was now on her feet. She tried to grab the axe, but I pushed her away. She stumbled back, hitting her head on one of the beams supporting the roof, and then collapsed silently onto the floor. I looked at the bundle. The baby was blue and did not seem to be breathing. She must have smothered it while trying to keep it quiet. I looked out the little window on the side of the hayloft and saw the girl running across the meadow. Then a shot rang out and she fell. Stepan was calling me from below. Come down already, we don't have all day. As I walked back to the ladder, I felt something under my foot. I bent down and picked it up. It looked like a little notebook filled with scribbles in a script I had never seen before. Did you finish the job? Stepan shouted. They're all dead, I replied. Did you find any money or gold there? No, there's nothing up here, I said, and stuck the little notebook into my pocket. When I walked out of the barn, Stepan and the other men were getting ready to leave. The men's clothes were stained with blood, and they were making jokes about the Hutzel's wife. We found a nice bundle there, said one of them. The Jews must have given these pigs all they had. All right, Stepan said, it's time for breakfast. You, he turned to me, clean up the mess here. Get them all into the barn and burn it down. Then you can join us. We'll even have some vodka for you. He did not say where I should meet them, and I did not ask. They walked off and disappeared in the forest. And now I'll just read one very short paragraph. And this is from Judith's diary. So Judith is the girl who runs out and is shot. And she was writing a diary, and that's what he found. And that diary ends up in various ways in an archive in Poland. And that it was retrieved in 2019. And she wrote it in Hebrew, which is why he could not recognize the script. And that's the last entry in her diary. This morning, I woke up very early because I heard a noise outside. Father and Mama are sleeping. Mama is holding David to her breast. It is very stuffy in the hayloft. I'm itching all over from the lice. I looked out through the crack. A big truck came from the village. The Germans were shouting. Then they got into the automobiles and drove away. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood on a haystack and opened the hatch in the ceiling. The cold air made me gasp. The darkness was lifting. There was not a cloud in the sky. It was very still and quiet. A large butterfly flew up toward me, and I was jealous of it for being so free when I am locked inside. Now I will go back to sleep and write more later. I'm very hungry, but soon we will be free. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bartov. That was, I had a bunch of adjectives, like written possible adjectives in my thank you to you, and none of them are sufficient. That was overwhelming. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Professor. That was overwhelming, and I've read the book. But to hear your voice saying the parts was really amazing. Do we have any Zoom questions? It doesn't look. Yeah, we'll start with the Zoom questions.
We actually don't have any on Zoom yet, so let's do
okay.
in person.
So let's do does anyone have an in-person question here or a comment? If you'd like to raise your hand. Yes, please. There's a mic over here, so that way the Zoom people will be able to hear you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov, for that wonderful presentation. I was reading a little bit of the biography about you before I came. So you were born in Israel?
Yeah.
But do you speak Ukrainian or all those other languages that you've done your research in? Are you a polyglot?
I'm not a polyglot, but yeah. So I was born and raised in Israel. I lived in the U.S. and in Britain as a child and as a teenager. I learned German for my early research, and I learned French because I thought
That's the language of politics, right?
I did some, yeah, and I did some research, and also I like it. And then when in '95, when I went through that sort of transformation, I had to use other languages. So I learned Polish.
Oh my God.
I can't say that my Polish it's far from perfect, but I can read it. I learned some Ukrainian, especially Western Ukrainian, which is quite close to Polish. It was not very difficult.
So it is
And
not
I learned
closer
Yiddish,
to Russian, it's
yeah.
closer to Polish.
Yeah, yeah, especially in the West, yeah. There's less Russian in it, and there's more Polish in it. So it was easier. And I discovered that if you know, obviously if you know Hebrew and some Polish and German, then you can read Yiddish.
Yes.
So I can read Yiddish as well, so, yeah.
Well, I was asking because your other books you've written, the academic books about the Ukraine and the Holodomor and
Yeah.
what you're speaking about in your novel.
Yeah.
It rang kind of, I was struck by how similar it sounded, the execution of what went on in Israel on October 7th. The strict forward brutality of going to the execution. And I wondered where you got your, because this was obviously written because of a lot of your research. So where did that come from, that story of that family?
Well, the story of this family in particular, as I was saying earlier, is my attempt to fill in the gaps of what we know about that family. They were murdered there. They were murdered in a way that happened 1,000-fold. There was nothing special about the way they were murdered, but every death is special. Every death is unique, but it happened over and over again. Many Jews in those parts of Europe, obviously many were, the majority were murdered by the Germans. And I talk about that here too in some other section in mass executions, but many others, particularly in remote communities, were often murdered by their neighbors. And which is what I describe in Anatomy of a Genocide. And there I use the documentation as well as many testimonies of people, what people remembered. And one interesting aspect of that was that many people who survived the Holocaust in those parts would say in the testimonies, or would say to me personally, would say the Ukrainians, they were worse than the Germans. And that's a sort of a very axiomatic sort of thing. People say it. Now, it's actually not true.
I'm having a little technical issue. Sorry about that. Please ignore me.
It's actually not true in the sense that the Germans were so bad, it was very hard to be worse than the Germans. So, yeah, but the Jewish experience with the Soviets is different in those areas for reasons I can also talk about. But the reason people said that the Ukrainians were worse than the Germans is that the Ukrainians were their neighbors. And so when Germans came from Germany, these Jews don't know them from Adam. They came and they killed them. But when your neighbor, with whom your daughter used to do homework with your neighbor's daughter, they would come on Friday and you'd give them a slice of sweet bread, of challah. You knew each other, and your parents knew each other, and your grandparents knew each other. And so when someone that you've known all your life, who lives across the street from you, one day comes into your house with an axe and kills you, that is worse than the Germans, because it's so intimate, because it's people you know. And that's part of the what I call the sort of the intimacy of genocide. It's one thing that people come from the outside, they don't know you, they organize you, and they kill you. And it's another when it's part of the social dynamic of the community in which you live. Now, when you talk about the events of October 7th, I can talk about that. But let me say one thing. Massacres, if you actually investigate them, are always horrific. And what occurs in them, which is nowadays would be streamed with people's cameras and put on Facebook or whatever, the details are always horrific and gory.
But it's so evil.
Right.
So
I mean,
that's what unifies this.
what I want to
whole-
say is that, and I've written about that recently, that there was a tendency to talk about what happened just now on October 7th as a pogrom, as akin to a pogrom. And I don't agree with that at all. That's like saying that 9/11 was a pogrom. It's a terrorist attack. And a terrorist attack is usually horrible. But a pogrom is something that a majority population, which happens to be the majority population of that state, does to a minority. That's not what happened there. There, the army is Jewish, the police is Jewish, the government is Jewish. So the people who did that are terrorists. You can call them any other name you like, but it's not a pogrom in the sense of a majority mob attacking a minority. So I want to be very careful with that, because we make analogies that I think confuse our understanding of what happened in Israel. And I just don't think it's helpful. The reality of killing people, of torturing people, of doing absolutely heinous crimes, that you can find all over the world. Unfortunately, there's no dearth of that.
Any other questions?
I have one. I guess one of the adjectives for your book is haunting. You know, it stays with you, and you've devoted much of your career to investigating and writing about and analyzing haunting, horrible, inhumane acts. And he's such a nice guy, you know. So, I mean, how do you balance personally your professional career and delving into that, and sleeping at night, kind of thing? Yeah.
I don't sleep a lot, but no, you know, I mean, I remember being asked that a long time ago, and I'd say that's the research I do, and this is my life, and I sort of separate the two. I think when you get older, it actually gets more difficult than when you're young. Maybe there's an accumulation of that. Maybe it's because you begin to feel the frailty of your own life, and more people that you know becoming ill or passing away. And so there's a kind of personal proximity to death. So I can't say that I'm separated from it. And I can say that there are moments in which it becomes especially difficult. I remember when I was doing research for Anatomy of a Genocide and going through all those accounts, I had a bunch of accounts by women who, some of them were much older when they gave the testimonies, but at the time, they were between 9 and 12 years old. And my daughter at the time was that age. And that was very hard to do. So there is, when you cannot make that separation, as a historian, you are trained to distance yourself from the thing that you're doing. Because if you become too involved in it, then you lose perspective, then you can't work objectively on that. In my own work, I've become increasingly, not only in writing this, but also in writing history, more involved personally. That is, involving myself personally in the story that I'm telling. And that raises many challenges. but it's also, to my mind, what happens as a result of it is that you can gain a different kind of insight that is difficult to gain when you insist on this complete separation. What you write about and who you are never come together. It's just your profession. That engagement, that intimacy with it, helps you empathize with the characters. So just as one example, when I was writing about Mihailo, this now he's dead, but he died in 2016. He doesn't exist, Mihailo. He's a fictional character, but when I was writing about him, I began to really understand where he's coming from. And I'm not Ukrainian. I could have been, had there not been the Holocaust. I might have actually grown up in Buchach, but it did, and my mother left, and so history went in another direction. But I was sharing it with a good Ukrainian friend, and she really liked him. She really thought that he reminded her of people that she knew, and I think it was part of me really trying to see the world through his eyes. He's a murderer. I mean, it's not someone that you necessarily love, although his grandson loved him, of course. So in that, you make yourself more vulnerable by coming closer to your historical or fictional protagonist, but by that, you also understand them better. And that's part of it, I think, for me.
I think we have time for one more question. Let me come over with the microphone. Wait. But they need it for Zoom. They can't hear you on Zoom.
The story of women having to make a decision, either to kill the baby or not, was a common thing. Me as a child growing up in Kiryat Chaim, people on my street, people that I knew very close to my family. I know one woman that had to decide a day before the war was ended, a day before, because where she hid, she was told either you kill the baby or else, a day before. And all her life, she was sobbing about it, all her life. It's a very hard thing, of course. Do we have any estimation, or do you know? I mean, it's hard question, but do we know approximately how many babies have been lost that way? I mean, I know there's so many stories, but is there any estimation by Yad Vashem or anybody else that ever done a research on it?
No. What you're saying, I mean, I've encountered many cases in which babies were smothered, and at times it was unintentional, right? I mean, the mother just was trying to make the baby not be heard when they're in hiding, and there are Germans or Ukrainian police walking on top of them, and they just cover them and they smother them, or they are also very scared, and so they hold them very tightly, and as a result of this, the baby dies. There are cases where the babies were smothered not by their mothers, but by other people who are hiding there and who want to survive. But there's no way that you could estimate that you could quantify that, because in many, I know of several cases where there are different versions, very, very different versions of what happened. And
I'm actually, if it's okay, I'm going to stop you just because we do have children in the room.
Yeah,
that might
okay.
be a tough conversation to continue. So maybe that conversation could happen privately. I have one question that hopefully is slightly lighter. I don't know. Yeah. We saw slides that you had us look at. What are those slides, or what are they from? What do they represent?
Okay.
Please.
Yeah. So all the pictures you saw are in the book, and they're not labeled. So the book doesn't tell you who is what there. They're placed in certain places in the text. In some cases, the text refers to them. In some cases, you would make a direct association. And in some cases, there is, I think, or I hope, a kind of conversation between the image and the words on the page. But I think that they give another dimension to the reading. The sources vary. So some of them are family photographs. Some of them are archival photographs. Some of them are photographs that were taken or that I took that are neither family nor archival, but relate to the text. And I can give you one example. This photo on the cover that appears also in the text, most people who know me or who read the book think that it's a photo of my mother. And it could have been, but it's not. And her mother, my mother's name was Judith. So, yeah.
Are there any further questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have to stay up here for a minute, though. I have a couple of announcements, and then we have a drawing for a bag of books. Thank you so much. We have some events coming up this week. There's a Zoom event, Palestine 1936, which is probably 1936 and very current right now, kind of the root of what some of the things we're dealing with right now. Next Saturday night should be a fun event. Saturday night at Temple Beth Israel. The American Way, the story of Jewish refugees, Superman and Marilyn Monroe, and yes, it all goes together. And then be sure to read Incident at San Miguel, which is our One Book, One Community. So we want people to read that ahead of time, and there's a reader's guide there. But for those of you who fill this out, we have a bag of books, and we'd like our speaker to pick one out of the basket, please. Thank you. And the winner is Helene Emmerich. Yes. Okay. She's back there. Okay. Well, she's in the kitchen. Okay. Of course she is. Of course she is. So she gets a bag of books. So thank you very much. Our author will be signing in the corner. There's our beautiful buffet sponsored by the Zeller family. Oh, and please, before I knock everything down, please purchase books. Both Professor Bartov's books and the rest of the books from the book festival are available. So thank you very much.
Thank you.